Thank you, Paul, for being so kind. Paul threatened to offer an alternative introduction earlier on for those who were in earlier, so I'm glad that that he didn't follow through on that. But I still think Hetty should have a red car. But there you go. I appreciate the brother also reading that passage from Acts chapter 4 for us, and we'll look at that a few times through the night if you've got your Bibles ready. I will try and speak as clearly as possible. So we are known for speaking quite fast. John's given me the thumbs up. So if someone from Tennessee can understand me, then there's no excuse in South Africa. We speak a little bit faster, and I'll try and make sure to keep it fairly slow, but I've got you on gallery view so that I can see most people in the room. And if I get to going too fast, someone just wave at me, and I'll recognize that I need to slow it down. In Acts chapter 4, and I really appreciated the prayer by the young brother there as well this evening. That was just beautiful prayer and very encouraging to see him leading us in that. In Acts chapter 4, what a transformation we have. What has happened here? We see here a couple of men who, not so long ago in Matthew chapter 26, verse 55 and 56, these were the guys who were fleeing. These were the guys who were running in all directions during Jesus' arrest. And here they are just a few weeks later. In fact, keep a mark on Acts 4, because we will go back there. But here they are, even in Acts chapter 1, if you go back to there. And you see in verse 4, and while staying with them, Jesus is still with them, he says, and while staying with them, he ordered them not to depart from Jerusalem. Now, that might seem pretty simple instruction, but to me, that seems like a fairly tall order for a bunch of guys who were running off in all directions just a few days before. But he orders them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father, which he said, you heard from me, and jump down to verse 12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey away. So here we have some guys who had already established themselves as runners, but here they are staying. This is night and day. This is opposite poles here. These are the same men who from Matthew chapter 26, verse 58, and John chapter 19, verse 38, and John chapter 20, verse 19, it had become a habit. These were the guys who were hiding for their lives. But in Acts chapter 2, verse 14, we find the complete opposite. It says, but Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them. Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and give ear to my words. Here's the guys who were the same men who were hiding. They're now standing. They're standing up and they're standing out. These are the same disciples from Mark chapter 14, verse 70 to 72, who were denying that they even knew Christ. They were denying that they had anything to do with him. Yet in Acts chapter 4, just a few verses before the passage, the text that our brother read for us, go back to verse 10 this time. Here they are. These are the guys who were denying Jesus only a few days before. Let it be known to all of you and to all the people of Israel that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him, this man is standing before you well. This Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders, which has become the cornerstone. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. These men are proclaiming the gospel when only a few days later they were denying even knowing Christ. And here they are acknowledging him before this crowd, before these people who are unbelievers, who have crucified Jesus not long ago. What's happened here? And this is not just Peter and John. If you look at the early church, look at those early Christians, especially go up to Acts chapter 8. And it goes beyond, but even just that, those few chapters, what has happened to provoke such a transformation? We know it was the resurrection. We know that. That's the short answer. Resurrection kind of does that to a person. If you think about Lazarus, go to John chapter 11. Let's look over this story again. We call them Bible stories. I almost hate to use the word story because it sounds like it's not real. Let's look at this event in history. Look at John chapter 11 and go to verse 41. And it says, so they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. And we know the rest of the event. We know about this. We know what happened. We also know about the kind of effect that the resurrection had. Look just to the next chapter. Look at verse 9. Now Lazarus has been raised from the dead now, and it says, when the large crowd of Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. We don't really know too much, surprisingly, for a man who has been raised from the dead in such a dramatic fashion, as if there was a non-dramatic way to do that. We don't really know too much about Lazarus. This is pretty much all we know post-resurrection. In John chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, we find that he's sitting down to dinner, so they have a meal together. And then by the time we get to verse 10 of chapter 12, there's been a death sentence pronounced on him. Why? Why such a transformation? Why is it gone from everything's okay, we need to kill this man? Was it simply the Pharisees trying to get rid of the evidence? I mean, can you imagine the life of Lazarus after that day? Can you imagine what he did each day? Can you imagine the outlook that he had on life? Can you imagine how his priorities might have changed? Can you imagine what he said and how he spoke? He'd been dead a few days earlier. Can you imagine what he talked about? I should say, can you imagine what he never stopped talking about? And one of my favorite things to think about, can you imagine how he worshipped? How he sang? How he prayed? How he thanked God? How he loved God? Can you imagine the kind of life that this man began to live post-resurrection? I like to think that the chief priests weren't simply trying to get rid of the evidence. I think it was much more than that. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Compare that to John chapter 9. John chapter 9, we have another event, this time involving a blind man. And I want you to imagine this blind man's life up to this point. We know how he would have been regarded by those of the time. We know that he would have been, well, I shouldn't even say regarded. We know how he would have been disregarded and assumed that he had committed some great sin. We know that that was part of their culture and part of their theology at that time. But look at verse 8 of John chapter 9. The neighbours and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? They knew who he was. They were familiar with him sitting there day after day. In verse 2 and 3 of the same chapter, we have confirmation of their opinion of him when it says, and his disciples, this is even the disciples, asking Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Of course, Jesus answered and said it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. This blind man this blind beggar, he was a beggar because he was blind, because he was an outcast. He was a nobody. And boy, he knew it. And his society around him, they made sure he knew it. Nobody had anything to do with him. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. But look at him post-healing. We talk about Lazarus post-resurrection. Look at this man post-healing. Look at him in verse 17. So they said, this is the Pharisees now talking to him. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? And the blind man said, he is a prophet. Here he goes from being a blind, begging, disregarded outcast at the side of the street to not just conversing with the Pharisees, but to witnessing to the Pharisees. We know that his parents wouldn't even do that, and his parents weren't outcast like he was, because when the Pharisees asked his parents to make comment, they said, oh, no, don't ask us. We don't want anything to do with that. We don't want to be making comment on that. They didn't even have the boldness to talk to the Pharisees like this man. But post-healing, he'd gone from begging to witnessing. What a change. Look at verse 20. Let's just look at his life. Let's begin in verse 24. Let's just read this part. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, and they were talking about Jesus, obviously. The beggar answered, he answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, though, that I was blind, now I see. They said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I have told you already. You would not listen. He's talking to the Pharisees. You would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Oh, they're not going to like that question. And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He's preaching a sermon to the Pharisees. Just a few hours ago, he was the outcast at the side of the road who wouldn't have lifted his head to say a word other than asking for some help. He went from outcast to teacher. Then the Pharisees tried to make him an outcast again. Verse 34, they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. They tried to keep him in his outcast situation. But notice they didn't threaten to kill him. There's a difference here from what happened with Lazarus. Now, there's been a change in this man's life, and they've cast him out the synagogue, but there's no death threat. His life is altered beyond anything he could have dreamed. But what's the difference between him and Lazarus? What was it that moves Lazarus from just being pronounced as cast out, moves him to the point where, no, we actually have to put this one to death. We actually have to give this one a death sentence. And I think it's because Lazarus is living the resurrection life. And everyone that saw him knew it. Everyone heard it every time he spoke, every time he walked by, every time he helped someone, every time he worshipped. He is living the resurrection life. You know, this may all seem so far away from our own experiences today, but I want you to consider another event. Go back to Luke chapter 19. I want us to remind ourselves that Jesus didn't have to use miracles to change lives. Look at Luke 19, and you'll be familiar with this event. It's about a man called Zacchaeus. And I want you to consider his position in society. Look there at verse 3. And he was seeking to see Jesus, see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. And we know that he was a tax collector. He was a Jew who was working for the Romans. Didn't go down well. Nobody liked him. Nobody wanted to be with him. Nobody wanted to have anything. He was an outcast. He was hated. He was hated by his own people. In verse 7, he even says about himself, or they said about him, and when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Now, they knew they were sinners as well. When they're saying he was a sinner, they're talking about this man is unworthy. Jesus shouldn't be with him. He is unworthy. But look at Zacchaeus after that visit. We've talked about Lazarus post-resurrection. We've talked about the blind man post-healing. Let's look at Zacchaeus post-visit. Look at verse 8. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. What a transformation. He has gone from a hated, cheating, stealing man to someone who is reformed, repentant, restorative, who wants to make right the things that he's done. And remember, this is quite a commitment. There's no online banking for Zacchaeus where he can just get the bank accounts and transfer the money back in. He's going to have to go and visit each one of those of his countrymen personally and admit and acknowledge the fact that he has taken more than he should have and give it back to them fourfold. If he's given it back fourfold, he's taken a bunch of money. And he's going to have to do that personally. This is a transformation in this man. But we don't find any pronouncements at all made against the new Zacchaeus. We don't read about that. I'm sure there were some, but Lazarus, it's made very clear, they want him dead. The blind man, they want him cast out. Zacchaeus, we don't hear any pronouncements at all. We know that this changed his life. Certainly it had to affect his employment. But by the records alone, it looks like the Pharisees, in comparison to the blind man and Lazarus, pretty much left him alone. Not Lazarus, though, because he was living the resurrection life. And everybody knew it. And that's what's going on here with the early church. And that's what we can learn from them. That's one of the things that we can learn from them, is that they understood the resurrection. They were living resurrection lives. That's why they were strong. That's why they were bold. That's why they were together. You see all in those opening few chapters of Acts. That's why they were so impactful. That's why they were loving one another. That's why they were sharing with one another. That's why they were united. That's why they were growing, because they were living the resurrection life. What about us? Do we not live after the same resurrection? Are we not, let me put it even more plainly, are we not changed by the same resurrection? What is it that the early church understood about the resurrection? What was it that they got about resurrection living that we need to get? The answer, although they are not all resurrection events, literally, the answer is in all three of those very simple and very well-known examples that we've looked at today. Because despite all of the differences in those events, the differences in their stories, they have at least one thing in common. They are all about second chance. They are all about fresh start. Every one of them, all of those events, all about new beginning. They're all about the freedom from the chains that shackled them in the way that they were living before. You see, Zacchaeus, he wasn't just visited. He was released from the ways of greed and corruption that he had been living by. He was released from that. Can you imagine the effect? I remember reading about Rockefeller, who, I guess, one of the richest men that have ever lived. And at 53, apparently, he was given 1 year to live. And so he decided that he was going to spend that year giving away his wealth. And he did that. He changed his life in the sense that he freed himself from the wealth that perhaps had become, well, a chain on his life, and certainly a burden. You know, he lived until he was 98 years old. He lived another 45 years. Zacchaeus didn't just have a visit from Jesus. He was freed in the way that he was able to live. The blind man, yeah, it's great. We love to see that kind of healing. The blind man wasn't just healed. You think about how he was treated his entire life because of his blindness. He wasn't just healed. He was freed from that lifetime of abuse and disdain and contempt. He was freed from that. You can tell by the way that he's talking to the Pharisees. What about Lazarus? Jesus said, unbind him. Lazarus, though, wasn't just unbound from grave clothes. He was unbound from an ordinary life. And the early church, at best, those in the early church, at best, they had been shackled by a law as Jews. They had been shackled by a law that they could not keep, a law that convicted them of their sin every day. Not now. They're under the grace of God. At best, at worst, they were guilty of slaughtering, literally, if they had been in that crowd at the time, they were literally guilty of slaughtering the Son of God. A guilt, let's be honest, that would be enough to destroy anyone. And Jesus freed them from that. That didn't have to have that kind of impact in their life. You see, the resurrection wasn't just of Jesus. It was also of them. Church, what is it that restrains us? Christian, what is it that keeps us down? Or if you are not a Christian and do not know this resurrection life, what is it that holds you back? You know, we're not talking about everyone becoming, from Acts chapter 4, we're not talking about everyone becoming a Peter or a John. That's just the text we used as an example. Verse 13 of that passage that was read to us earlier in chapter 4 from the New Living, I use the ESV, but I like the way the New Living translation puts it, and that's where I took my title from, that the members of the council were amazed. ESV says astonished. The members of the council were amazed when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, for they could see that they were ordinary men with no special training in the scriptures. They also recognized them as men who had been with Jesus. And because of that last phrase and the resurrection of Jesus, they had gone from being ordinary men to being the men who amazed the members of the council. And you can see it all through Acts. The early church living the resurrection life. Acts chapter 1, they're staying the course. They're staying in Jerusalem. They're waiting for the Holy Spirit. Acts chapter 2, they're standing up and they're standing out. They're showing unity at the end of that chapter. They're showing the unity and the joy and the love that the resurrection of Jesus has enabled them to do. In Acts chapter 3 and 4 and 5, we have them speaking up and witnessing and declaring the gospel. In Acts chapter 6, serving the needy and taking care of those who need, as Jesus would want us to and does want us to. And then in Acts chapter 7, when we come to Stephen and we see him seeing the glory as he stays faithful as they take his life. The early church did not wallow in their inadequacies or their failures or their sin, and they had them. And brethren, neither should we. And if you're not a Christian yet tonight, neither should you. The early church didn't put their chains back on after they came out the waters of baptism, and neither should we. I heard an old story years ago, and I can't remember where I heard it, but it was a story about a little boy who, with his sister, who was visiting his grandparents' farm, and his grandfather gave him his first catapult. I think in America, Johnny, I think you guys call it a slingshot, okay? We call it a catapult. And I don't know what you call it in South Africa. I'm not sure, but everyone knows what I'm talking about, hopefully. So he gives him his first catapult, and the wee boy goes out and he's practicing in the woods, right? And he's not very good. He's never hitting anything that he's attempting to hit. He never hits it. So he's coming back to the farmhouse. He intends to practice again tomorrow, but he spots his grandma's pet duck, and on impulse, he's not hitting anything anyway, he takes aim and he lets fly, and the stone hit and the duck fell dead. And the boy panicked. Desperately, he hid the dead duck in the woodpile, only to look up and see his sister watching. She had seen it all, but she didn't say anything. After lunch that day, Grandma said, "Sally, let's wash the dishes." Sally said, "Tommy told me he wanted to help in the kitchen today, didn't you, Tommy?" And she whispers to him, "Remember the duck." So Tommy did the dishes. Later, Grandpa asked if the children wanted to go fishing. Grandma said, "I'm sorry, I need Sally to help make dinner." Sally smiled and said, "That's all taken care of, Grandma. Tommy said he wants to do it." And again she whispered, "Remember the duck." And Tommy stayed while Sally went fishing. After several days of Tommy doing both his chores and Sally's, finally he couldn't stand it anymore, and he confessed to his grandmother he'd killed the duck. His grandma said, "I know, Tommy." And she gave him a big hug. She said, "I was standing at the window and saw the whole thing. Because I love you, I forgave you already. I just wondered how long you would let Sally make a slave of you." We do that sometimes. Resurrection life is not about us becoming world-class evangelists. It's about us living unshackled. Resurrection life is not about us, like Peter and John, perhaps literally putting our physical life on the line, although some Christians are called to do that even today. It's not just about that. It's about believing in second chances. Resurrection life is not about, like we've read, getting arrested for your faith. It's about going from a life ordinary to a life amazing. That's resurrection life, and it can be anyone's. When we became Christians, we knew that was true. Man, we were on fire. We were excited. But all too often, we let that liar tell us that we have worn out our chances. I remember, it's just actually coming to my mind, there's a passage in Revelation that talks about the accuser, the deceiver who will accuse us, Satan. And I remember when I was looking at that last year, we were doing a study on Revelation. I remember looking at that and I'm thinking, you know, if he's accusing us, what's the deception? Because if he's accusing me of sinning, that's not a lie. Brethren, that's the truth. Now, I don't think he's going to come up with a lie, something like, Adam, you have, you're guilty of murder. I don't think he's going to try and lie to me that way, because I'm going to know that's not true. He's not going to be able to pull that one over my eyes. I think the deception is not that you've sinned, because that's true. I think the deception is you've sinned so much you've run out of chances. Brethren, that's a lie. Friend, Christian or not, that's a lie. I think his lies are along the lines of, oh, Father's going to be mad, and you know what? I think this time he's going to stay mad. That's a lie. We let him steal resurrection life from us if we believe that kind of talk. We sing that song, I don't know if you sing it there in South Africa, the steadfast love of the Lord from Lamentations chapter 3. His mercies are new every morning. His resurrection life is new every morning. There's a song, and I can't remember who sings this song, that I love the words to it. It's called Come Awake. And it talks about, it's talking about resurrection life. And it's basically saying to anyone, Christian or not, are you ashamed of your past? Maybe we're ashamed of our present. Are we drowning in the poor choices that we have made? Are we trapped in a sin or a weakness or a failure? Or are we swamped by things like guilt and insecurity and rejection? Church, they've all been removed. We live in and by the resurrection. That is second chance, fresh start, new beginning living. And the words of the song, the chorus, it goes like, come awake, come and rise up from the grave. Living in the resurrection means that we are not slaves to our sins. We are not running out of chances. We are not ordinary. Man, we are not even guilty because of the grace of God and the blood of Christ. The early church lived the resurrection life, and they left us a legacy and an example for us to do the same. But it's not even just what they did. I mean, I love that part at the end of Acts chapter 2 where they're just together. It's not even just what they did. It's who they were. It's how they saw themselves. Because they saw themselves in the light of that resurrection. Listen, and again, whether you're Christian or not tonight, Christ did not raise up or raise us up to live like poor beggars at a roadside. One of the lines in that song, Come Awake, is, "Oh church, come and stand in the light. His resurrection is our resurrection." This evening, I want to encourage you. I want to challenge us, if we're Christians, to be the church that Christ literally raised us to be, which is anything but ordinary and everything to do with amazing. And if you're not a Christian tonight, that can be yours. That resurrection life. And it's not waiting for eternity. It starts now. It will change everything about you. It will change everything that you ever thought to be true, every perspective you've ever had. And it will lift it to a level that, to be honest, if you don't have Christ in your life, you're actually not able to even imagine. He will turn your life upside down and change you from ordinary or however low or high you think of yourselves to something that is amazing as you rise up out of the waters of baptism with anything that has dragged you down in the past or maybe even continues to do so, removed, so that those impacts are taken away. And we allow Jesus and his resurrection to be the thing that has the impact in the way that we live, the way that we talk, what we say, and who we become. If you are not a Christian tonight and as we all do at times, struggle with enjoying the resurrection life that Jesus intends for us to have, I know that the brethren here, the elders that are in this room tonight, I know that they would love to pray with you. And if you're not a Christian tonight, I know that they are ready for you to remove those chains, to get rid of those shackles, and put Christ on in the waters of baptism and live the resurrection life for the rest of your days and beyond. And I would encourage you to make yourself known in this room, and they will speak to you about that and be more than happy to do so. God bless.
I sung a